Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I think it's time to officially kick off our day. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to be here and introduce our program. So today we are going to have a series of very fast-paced and thought-provoking discussions on where museums are now, where they want to be, and how they can get there. My name is Samantha Koslow, and I have the great privilege of serving as head of the museum team here at Christie's. It's my pleasure to introduce the man of the hour, Stephen Reily, to get our conversation started.
Thank you, Sam. I just want to really thank Samantha and Ben Wine of the Museum Services Division here, who have shown really genuine interest and support from my work even before I had any idea what I was going to do. So they gave me confidence that we would find things to do with Remuseum that would be of interest to the field. And I just, no one has to do that. So I'm very grateful for them and their willingness to host us so generously with their colleagues here today. Thank you. Really quickly, Remuseum is a museum think tank focused on issues of relevance, financial sustainability, and governance. It was inspired and funded by David Booth, who's going to join us today in partnership with Alice Walton and Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, with additional support from the Ford Foundation and the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation. Remuseum looks at those topics and supports them in two ways. One, we generate research and share data and insights around relevance, financial sustainability, and governance. And two, we support the leaders who are at the cutting edge of finding new solutions to these critical issues. We do those in lots of ways, one of which is hosting convenings. Two of those have been held at Paradox Cove, the home of David Booth and Heather Pizzanti in Austin, Texas, which is not just an extraordinarily museum-like setting itself, but an inspired site for innovative thinking. And what we're going to hear today are case studies that came out of a convening held in January at Paradox Cove of this year. And it was about collections. Collections are the treasures of museums. They preserve cultural heritage, they give us something to study, they draw audiences. If you look at museum press releases and annual reports, they're just about the biggest thing that museums celebrate when they add to their collections. And there are always important reasons to be adding to museum collections, whether it's finding new forms of art and the art of our time to add to them, whether it's filling gaps represented by types of artists, regions, media that were underrepresented in museum collections before, or adding that occasional extraordinary masterpiece that will become a crowning jewel in the collection. At the same time, those growing collections, especially when every object is owned 100% by each museum, most of which is rarely seen, present their own costs. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So let's start with the data. And I'm going to share some numbers that we've been able to compile from very limited resources. One of the things we've shown is the field needs a lot more data. But really quickly, we estimate that in 2025, the 200 largest art museums in America collectively own about 18 million objects. It's interesting as we get to that number in part by extrapolating back to 1988 for some reasons about studies that took place then that I don't have time to go into today. But what it shows is 36 years represented a doubling of these collections, or a 2% growth rate. And that is about right when you look at what's happening. And what that means, of course, is that inexorable and very steady growth rate, if you know compounding interest, will lead to a doubling every 36 years. And so there is no reason not to think that those same 200 museums in America will have 36 million objects 36 years from now, which is a lot. Now let's look at the cost of collections, where the data is even less clear. And I have to be honest, we're doing our best to try to make even a ballpark estimate of what it costs for museums to maintain these collections. There's a very important PhD dissertation written in 2002, which actually goes back to the same number, 1988, which is why it's become sort of important. And in that, a researcher named Ann Stone uses a methodology developed by the museum architect George Hartman to estimate that museum collections at that time cost $200 million a year to maintain. If you simply multiply by the rate of inflation growth since then and the doubling of those collections, you get to $1.1 billion today. If you go back to George Hartman's actual methodology, it actually leads to a much bigger number, which is the number at the top, which actually takes, he was the first one to show you had to do something to account for the cost of capital, the cost of building that space, not just using it every year. And I took his number and I generated it, and it was so outrageous I cut it in half, assuming that half the objects cost nothing, maybe are works of paper and cost nothing to store, which is excessively conservative, but you get to 2.8 billion. Now in Goldilocks fashion, we're gonna look at the number in the middle, because there's only one museum I know of in America, a major regional museum, that about 7 or 8 years ago entered to a very intense study of what it cost to store the art in its collection. And it was the first one that attributed indirect costs, the people costs of maintaining and storing the artwork. And at that time, they estimated that across their very large collection, it was costing them $106 per object to maintain the art every year. If you multiply that by 18 million objects and add a little bit for inflation from the time of that study, you get to $2.4 billion a year. I don't know what the right answer is, but you're looking at something I think many of you in this room probably feel, which is $2.4 billion looks a lot like about 50% or more of the annual operating budgets of these 200 museums. And at some point, I'm not here to say whether it's unsustainable or not now, at some point the encroachment onto the museum's ability to generate its other mission-based programs is going to become quite serious. And that's what we're kind of here to talk about. I want to talk about another study. So the folks from SF MoMA are doing an important event out there that I think Christie's partnering with them on today. But they're doing a couple things very interesting. Really quickly, SF MoMA has an accessions committee, like many museums, but they also have set up a new committee called the Collections Committee, who is a formal board committee whose job is to study the storage and utilization of the collection, separate from the acquisitions. As you know, many boards feel like they take a lot of work in, but they never talk about what's actually happening to it. And what they have found is that it's really interesting as they study their collection, because we look at numbers of objects and square footage. SF MoMA is looking at cubic feet, which is really a much more accurate number to look at. And what they're finding, they're actually grading every object in the collection from XX small to XX large. And they're finding the majority of the works they've acquired over the last 10 years are quite large, meaning that the problems are even greater, frankly, than we've estimated. One way to look at acquisitions is that they actually represent an allocation of future budget expenses towards each acquisition you make. And here's one way to think about it. The average museum maybe has 10,000 objects. There is no average, but that means they would add 200 objects a year. If you use the Goldilocks formula, that means that would cost them about $25,000 a year to maintain, which represents an allocation of $500,000 to $600,000 of their endowment to storing those year's acquisitions in perpetuity. Now, there are museums starting to ask donors to actually fund the perpetual maintenance and storage and utilization of the collections, but most objects are not covered in that way. So every museum needs to think more thoughtfully, and they are thinking more thoughtfully about it. As I said, the purpose of this gathering is not to suggest that museums should stop adding work to their collections. It is too important for many, many reasons. But the purpose is to recognize and celebrate ways that some leaders and institutions are finding new ways to own, acquire, care for, share for, and capture the value of these collections that form their very heart. So everything you see here is going to be in a report we've issued now. It's on our website. You can access it through the QR code on your program. If you're on Remuseum's newsletter list, you're going to get a copy of it by email right at the end of this event. And you're free to access and share it. And we're going to get right to the heart of the matter, partly because we want to cover a lot of these amazing case studies in not a lot of time, partly because I find sometimes going to conferences, I remember that one moment out of a long panel discussion that's stuck in my mind. So our goal here is to deliver those moments within our 15 or 25-minute segments. And with that, I'm going to call up our first group of 3 museum leaders, Francis Greenburger, Jamie Lawyer, and Seth Feman. We're going to start with the Frist, because the Frist is one of the few museums in the country without a collection. Nashville is a boom town. It was late to get a serious single art museum. And it has chosen, for reasons we're going to ask Seth Feman, its director, a native Nashvilleian, a little bit how that began and how the Frist thinks about being a museum without a permanent collection.
Thanks for doing this. Nice to see everyone. Brief. We love it. And I'm so glad that you're sharing this data because it really affirms the reasons why we've made the decisions that we've made. In our last strategic plan, which is now a year and a half in, we had the turn of phrase, we will explore the viability of starting a collection, which was a useful turn of phrase to basically say, we're going to look at it, but probably not going to do it. And it's because we've got this great model. For 25 years, or next year will be our 25th anniversary, we have been showing a changing series of exhibitions of art from around the world. We are probably the largest museum in the States that is a proper Kunsthalle that doesn't just focus on contemporary art, we focus on the art of the world. And we are not struggling with some of the issues that large collections have because we don't have so much depth in one area that we're compensating by buying in another. We don't have collection storage issues. We don't have some of these burdens. But I was at a talk earlier today that Michael gave, and you'll hear more from him later, about the things that they're doing at LACMA with their collection. And there are things to admire about having collections that we don't have. And so one thing that we're exploring is how could we have longer displays? How could we be a release valve for other collections that have so much depth that they don't know what to do with it? And what would that do to benefit the people of Nashville who don't have otherwise a very large display of collections on view all the time?
So talk a little about, because when you talk to your peers, no one's quite like you, right? So how do you think about the costs and benefits?
Yeah, so the costs of doing, we do about 15 exhibitions a year, and the cost of doing these enormous exhibitions is extremely expensive. And so we are in the very early stages of looking at what adding more exhibition space would look like. What if we had 6,000 square feet of additional space? The idea of doing 3 more exhibitions a year, the operation costs that go along with that of finding those exhibitions, of presenting them, of designing them, of marketing them, of running educational programs for them is totally prohibitive. We would probably have to double our operating budget in order to do that, just because we're at the maximum of our current staffing. And so there are also benefits to not trying to present constantly changing exhibitions because, as a colleague of mine has called it before, it's crack. Once you do it, you've got to keep doing it more and more and more and more. And we don't also want to go down that path. So looking for ways to share things long term, give people more of a chance to explore on their own. This is something Michael mentioned at the AFA event earlier today. When we have these shows, they're highly curated. And so we expect people to follow our exhibition goals and to learn the lessons that we want to communicate and to oftentimes march to the path that we've designed from them. But that does not give them an opportunity to invent their own path and to make connections in ways as readily as they might in a collection display. And so there's real value in having that approach as well.
What does it make your staff look like that's different from a museum with a collection?
So my chief curator likes to say he's a paintings 20th century and 21st century painting specialist. He also likes to say that he is our resident Egyptologist. Because our four curators have to be prepared to become experts in the art of the world. And so they might do a show of Venetian and Ottoman art and then turn around and do storybook art of Eric Carle and then turn around and do an Anila Aga contemporary show. And so it is a little bit of constant movement, but for the right curator, it is a very exciting opportunity because you get to constantly learn, you're constantly curious, and develop projects of your own along the way.
It's interesting to think about how much the average museum's curatorial staff is built around its collection, right? Rather than necessarily another goal. Seth, in Austin, you shared such an interesting insight of thought as you've thought about collections. Can you talk about when you're coming from a blank slate, what would it mean? When you went through that process, what if you took a collection? You had some really interesting thoughts about how you would immediately.
Yeah, I think if we were going to start a collection, which again, we're really probably not going to do, there are things that we would consider, like we can't collect the art of the world, which is what we exhibit. We can't collect antiquities. We can't imagine finding those things, and there's all sorts of challenges with those things. So when do we start? Do we start with 1934, which is when our building was created? Do we start with 2001, when the museum was founded? Do we start with the art of Nashville or the art of the region, where there is a real need for supporting the arts through acquisitions? Do we have a focused collection like the ICA, where they've focused very narrowly on their exhibition history? There are all sorts of different ways to approach imagining starting a collection without it going out ahead of you and not being beholden to the collections that are all around you that you don't actually want, which is, of course, a problem of collecting as well.
Right. And I remember you said, like, if, for example, someone in Nashville had created a collection of, let's just say, post-impressionist paintings or something, you took it, it would immediately change the identity of the museum, right? So it's just so interesting to think about when you don't have one, a new one does something very dramatic. A new collection does something quite different.
We'd inevitably be doing the catch-up game that I think a lot of our peer institutions are doing of, you have 50 incredible impressionist and post-impressionist work, the best in the world. Well, how do you find complementary work from all the rest of the world in order to have a balanced collection? And it's, as our colleagues know, it's impossible to do.
Right. I mean, one of the things, as you know, that I think is interesting is the Frist. It's young. It's still got a founding family very closely involved. Billy Frist is here. Thank you for joining your director here. And I think it's very interesting. It's sometimes easier to keep that discipline when you've got that founder mentality, something we'll be talking about with others here at the panel, and how to maintain that over time.
Yeah, it's liberating to be able to pivot so quickly. I think, as we all know who are involved in museums are slow. We operate very slowly, and it is very nice to be in a position where if we feel like there is a show that we need to do, we find it. And we can present it. We don't have to collect in order to do that. We can just find who has the collection and put it on view. That dynamism isn't necessarily what we were designed to do. It wasn't necessarily the founding mandate. I think the founding mandate was to present world-class art to people in Middle Tennessee who might not otherwise get to see it. But it has given us a kind of adaptability that I wouldn't want to ruin by hemming us in with a collection.
And I should also note, for people who haven't been there, you did not build a purpose-designed building for your museum.
Yeah, it's a 1934 post office building, and conveniently the central area, which is designed for sorting and packaging mail, is also very good for being a big open space that you can kind of do anything you want to. And we were able to kind of create a central area in the museum that is environmentally appropriate in a 1934 building that is otherwise not environmentally appropriate for art, and it gives us a lot of adaptability. We're very fortunate to have that.
I just think it's great to have examples of museums just doing it their own, finding the right way to be their best selves. So thank you, Seth. We're going to move to Francis Greenburger to my left. Francis is the founder of both Art Oh My and the Art Oh My Pavilions at Chatham, which we're going to talk about that because it has a really cool model. I'll describe, if you don't know it, really quickly. So Francis, in exchange, works with owners, collectors, artists, owners of collections who foot most of the costs of building a pavilion to exhibit their art in. And Art Oh My Pavilions then runs the infrastructure, visitor services, covers some of the costs of the design and construction, has some great architects working there, including Florian Eidenberg from So Ill, who's here. Francis, why is this idea working? How is it resonating? Because you've got Michael and Susan Hort are committed with their revolving selection of their collection to Art Oh My Pavilions, as does the artist Alice Aycock.
Well, I think, as you know, my background is in the real estate development business, where we think about where people want to work, live, and play all the time. And over the many years that I've been involved as an art collector and art appreciator, I recognize that both collectors and artists often have a vision for their work. There's a German word which I wrote down, which I'm not sure that I can pronounce, called, where is it? Gesamtkunstwerk, which means something like the overall artist. Or anyway, And when they transfer their works into other hands, they don't know how it's going to be exhibited. They don't know what context it's going to be exhibited in. They don't even know whether it's going to be exhibited. They're just trusting it to another caretaker. And there are artists and collectors who want to preserve their vision. I mean, we're all intimately familiar with one, Barnes, who had a very specific sense of that. But that sentiment exists in other people, and certainly I found it with Alice Aycock and with the Horts. So not for everybody, but for many artists and collectors, finding a way to preserve their vision for the future intact is more interesting than just turning it over to other people who will present it in the fashion that's appropriate for their priorities and their needs from time to time. And that's why this idea is finding resonance.
You've been involved for a long time at MOCA as an early board member, which experimented with similar models. But I'm really interested in hearing you own and run a literary agency started by your father, and you've built a very large real estate business. One of the things we talked about in Austin was that the model of each museum owning 100% of each object is kind of a narrow view of the ways that property rights or rights in general are divisible. How much did those models help inform your idea that you could segregate the right to exhibit from the right to own, or all 100 other rights, as people do in real estate and other
Right,
areas?
and I was, as you were making your presentation, I thought of it as, again, when we talk about the museums and the cost of maintaining collections and all of these things, the burden that the museum is accepting is big, and it's getting bigger and bigger. So sometimes dividing and conquering is an approach. And, I learned this in the real estate business when we started making buildings into condominiums and co-ops. And I was very involved in the early 80s. I think I converted 10,000 apartments in New York, 100 buildings, from rental to co-op. And ownership in individual hands spread the responsibility for the buildings. And in New York also spread the politics, so that people, and then the people who were living there could control their own destiny and to determine the environment that they wanted to be in. So that certainly informs my thinking. And you mentioned my literary background. Well, early in my life, sort of while I was doing publishing and real estate, odd bedfellows. But anyway, I was involved in managing the estate of Franz Kafka. And somewhere between Kafka and Max Brod, who was his literary executor, there were various very specific constraints that he imposed on, either Kafka imposed or Brod really imposed, on the way in which he wanted Kafka's works presented in the future. And that was always part of any license or anything that we had to do. So again, it was sort of preserving this, the legacy of Kafka's writings in a way that he wanted them to be. So this idea of creators not only being the custodian of work, their own or others, but having a vision for its presentation, I think is an important part of the legacy that comes with many art custodianships.
That's great. An executive with one of the big commercial real estate empires told me he was new to the museum world. He said, well, the problem of this field is a problem that can happen in commercial real estate is we've built these single-use structures, right, which then don't end up being very resilient or adaptable over time. How do you think about Art My Pavilion's future and how it might adapt to different eras, needs?
Well, again, because it's a shared model concept where the collector or the artist, certainly during their lifetime, participates in all of these decisions. both how it's exhibited and how it changes over time, and that it's a flexible structure. And then as time goes on, their estates will have a role and responsibility in carrying forward those decisions, and of course it'll be informed by discussions in advance. And because the financial model shares responsibility, there isn't this sort of inherited sense of obligation that museums get, that they have to do things in a certain way, they have to protect everything for the rest of time. That's not very flexible. And the reality is, as you point out so dramatically, is the burden is getting bigger and bigger, and we know what's happening to museums. They're being overwhelmed by it, and sort of they're losing their focus on presentation, and they're becoming custodians of warehouses full of art.
Well, congratulations. When will the pavilions open? I know you're underway.
We're underway. We're in construction, roughly 5 buildings, 3 to 3. Another one starts in a month. Another one starts in 2 or 3 months. The first building is actually be completed next month. We're not going to open to the public then. But by next fall, we think we've got a small critical mass, and we will then be open to the public. In between, we'll have a lot of invited events and things of that sort.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
We're going to move to Jamie Lawyer, the Deputy Executive Director of the Rubin Museum of Himalayan Art. And 2 quick things. One, Jamie works with her colleague, the director, Jorrit Britschke. I need to give Jorrit, who's stuck in Taiwan, not stuck, but not able to be here. Jorrit is the source of the title of this report, because it was in a conversation with him preparing for this convening. He just said, it's just kind of simple. We're just talking about more art for more people in more places. And I love that so much. I wrote it down at the time, and I've stolen it with credit. The other thing about the Rubin, I just want to say it kind of also gave genesis to this conversation more broadly. When the Rubin announced its decision, I thought this was a really interesting way for a museum to decide that maybe the best way to fulfill its mission of engaging the world with Himalayan art was not to require them to come to West 17th Street first, which was an unusual obligation, if you think about it that way, to fulfill it. And in Remuseum's modest social media following, I said something positive about it. And I had some people ask me, they said, well, I saw your post, that's great. It's like, but what is really going on with the Rubin? And I said that actually maybe it's just what they say. So I want to ask you first, talk about, announcing the decision and how you felt about it and how it's feeling now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. A big question is an opener. I appreciate that, Stephen. So we're almost a year into our transformed model, and we are still actively transforming. And I think at the genesis of our work, and you talk about mission for us, when Donald and Shelley Rubin said, hey, we want to open up a museum dedicated to Himalayan art in New York, everyone was like, no, what, really? What are you doing? So the idea of doing that was a revolutionary thought. And when you think about our mission in particular, our mission was really dedicated to presenting Himalayan art and its insights to the world. And we were doing that only for New Yorkers, and people could access us. So by being able to be a museum without walls, as we think about it, it was a bold way to ask that big question of what does it mean to truly deliver on our mission? And for a mission like ours, our collection is meant to be shared with the world. And that is what we are doing. Instead of just being here for New Yorkers, we're able to imagine bigger and break through those walls that, frankly, many of you in this room are doing. Anytime you send an educator into your community, you're expanding your digital reach and presence. You are expanding beyond your borders in service of community and audience. So for us to be able to do that, to be able to reimagine so boldly what it means to be a museum with, and not everyone's a fan of that, right? It's hard to shift minds of what it means to be a museum. But for us, it's not just a building, right? It's not a building that we experience in a singular place. So for us to be able to go out into the world, to pursue partnerships like at the Brooklyn Museum, right here in New York, right, with Anne, who was a great supporter.
Tibetan Shrine room, right, and can share it with many more people.
It's
her traffic.
it's allowed us to think differently about our work of a museum, to be more daring with what it means to serve communities, to actually go to communities. If that's in Florida, we can really be able to serve audiences there. And in some cases, we're seeing in projects like the Mandala Lab that we have traveling around the world, we saw audiences in 10 days. That was 4 months of what we would have seen coming through our physical presence. So we're really at the beginning, just 11 months out. There's still a lot that we are learning, and we're excited to continue to partner and share that knowledge with others, because it's about really delivering on our mission. It's not a retreat from what we do. It's an expansion of our work more broadly.
Can you talk a little, I'm always interested by, we underestimate what we might call opportunity costs, just the costs of the mental burden of, or just the allocation of time, of one's own time in running a building and now being free to do other things. Talk about maybe what that's meant for you all, including the digital immersive opportunities you've done.
Yeah. So as many of you all know, the cost of running a building is quite substantial, right? And when we do that, we're spending time investing in our building, which for many, that is part of your mission, to have a place to welcome people. That is one way to deliver your mission. But for us to be able to, we're still delivering exhibitions with partners. We're not just holding it to ourselves. It's given us the opportunity to share more broadly by thinking differently about, we don't have walls that we need to adhere to. We're here to partner with other organizations to share this. We have a dynamic collection. Why is it only for us? How do we partner with other institutions who want to tell really robust stories around Asian art and Himalayan art, but they say, we don't have the objects or the expertise to do so? Well, the Rubin's here to lend a hand to be able to build that capacity, to create possibility, to reach your audiences that you want to reach, but you haven't been able to. So for us to be able to partner in new ways has been exciting. We're supporting artists through grant projects, through research. So instead of just supporting our own in-house scholarship, we are able to think more broadly, to share more globally, to welcome in new types of research around a collection that is underrepresented, understudied, and we have a responsibility to make sure more people in the world love it and are committed to preserving and sharing it.
Thank you. I also think we just have to note a remarkable ability for a founder to let go of that. It's so easy to be attached to a place, and a beautiful place it has been, but to really lean into mission. So I want to thank these three presenters for really finding such extraordinary ways to lean into very specific missions and do it in their own way. It's going to be really fun to follow all three of you on that journey, on those journeys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael Govan, the Wallace Annenberg Director of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art.
Long title.
Thank you. Michael joined us at our convening. Unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, our gathering in Austin took place during the week of fires in Los Angeles, and Michael was generous enough to take time out of that to speak to us by Zoom. And one of the things you reminded us there is that early in life, or even till a certain point in life, you never imagined you would be a museum leader or professional. Can you talk about how that in particular led you to your own perspective on museum collections?
Yeah, I think I was mentioning, yes, I was mostly trained to be an artist, took art history sort of to get ideas, and but of course you need a day job if you're an artist, so you tend to work on museum catalogs, design, mass MOCA. I did the original drawings. So I think, though, that just that beginning led to an openness. I mean, artists are always absorbing the past into a future in a creative way. Art school is about a critique. You put yourself out there and then you get critiqued. And so it's a whole different system of thought. And so I think just that flexibility and creativity, since I never thought I would do this, just stuck with me. So that was helpful.
And then at LACMA, where you've been for, I've lost track,
20 years almost.
20 years. How has that perspective on what a museum's collection can be, how it can constrain the museum's capacity and fulfill it?
Well, we were talking, Seth, I would think mentioned, we were talking this morning about collections. I mean, collections are, the growth of collections can be the existential crisis of our museums because of the statistics you described. However, They're also the most economical and efficient way for us to serve our public sometimes if they're properly deployed. And I say there's two things. If you own a work, you can just put it somewhere forever, or you can show it this way today and that way tomorrow. For me, that's the key, because history is always changing. We're always rewriting, rethinking. And so to have collections which aren't there for an object for 3 months, but be able to see it from many sides, many perspectives. And then if you own your work, you have more ability to share it. Like I have a beautiful relationship with my conservation department. I really, really, really respect their science, but I want their science to tell me how I can lend it to the least museum-friendly places, not how to protect it from those places. There's two ways to use the science. And I liken that to, like, I don't want to, a doctor might tell you you shouldn't, like, climb a mountain, it's dangerous for your health. But a sports doctor will, like, patch you up to be on the field. And I think, like, I want sports doctors. If the work's not on the field playing, it's not doing any good. So that's interesting. And with collections, I've been able to really push that. We were the first museum to develop, like, the BEZO green standards for our climate and everything, because we own them. We can lend them to the county fair. 30,000 people in a week. It meets no climate control rules that you can imagine, but we found ways to make it safe. And so I think collections have that utility if you deploy it and use your freedom.
Mm-hmm. Great word. Talk about what the word encyclopedic has meant to you and how it's used.
Well, that's a long dissertation, not
okay.
Too much for this, but I will say I try to translate there is no encyclopedia. It's never complete. There is no world that's complete. And the encyclopedia keeps changing like history, what's included. But if you see it as anything goes museum instead of encyclopedic. So we have forks and spoons and blankets and movies and artworks. And I think, like, being able to roam through postcards to Rembrandt is very exciting. So I've tried to use it in a different meaning it can be anything in the cosmos that you want it to be.
That's great. And talk about big year for you. Congratulations on rounding the bend of the new building. I saw him a couple months ago and thought that I can't think of a building that has generated so much attention for giving tours of an empty new museum. So just think what the world will think when you've got the art in it. But you've also, I think you've made a remarkable part of your leadership, and will be in a long time your legacy of making collections more permeable. How do these two projects are actually quite related, right?
Yeah, I mean, the building was a very large building, controversial in a way just because it was different. It's horizontal, there's multiple entrances, the idea is there's no hierarchy, no front, no back, no up, no down. I said I wanted no facade. Peter Zumthor, the architect, said, you really want no one, means you want no one in the back. I said, correct, that's what I want, like Los Angeles. And then the transparency, and then the idea that it would be ever-changing. But the idea of ever-changing is then we could make it just, if you're decentering art history, it's ever-changing, we have no rules, no nations, no media divisions, and no chronology. Curators come up with thematic arrangements. It gives you another freedom, and also if you're rotating, you can put together packages and move them. So we are planning, much criticized, the museum's not big enough. I think 225,000 square feet of space and 4,000 objects on view at a certain time is enough. But the idea is we're building in North LA, South LA, and sort of decentering the museum itself. And then those little nuggets, packages, chunking, they call it in digital literature, can move around with its education programs and move around to regional museums, county fair, LACMA sites. The only place we're building is where there's really no place to lend to. So in East Los Angeles, we can lend to East Los Angeles College Museum. We work with them. But in South LA, there's no place in North LA. So this idea of building continued infrastructure, I know everything that costs money is a lot of overhead, but there's a place for it if you can deploy it, I think, well. And this 19th century idea that you have a small village, you put a museum in the center, is not conducive to our vast, sprawling metropolises where you could be an hour and a half away from LACMA in Los Angeles County.
You shared the loans. I love that you were the LA County Museum sharing work with the LA County Fair. It seems very appropriate to me.
It's very nice.
Not high risk, but you also struck relatively early on some key partnerships with both the Getty and the Autry. Can you talk about those and what those brought the art? Which I
Well, it
think
might
is
be fun to talk about that with the group here that we have, because I think this idea that was raised about ownership and thinking of singular ownership is just one model. So we, from the beginning, we've shared collections with the Getty, with other museums, and with the Autry. Why collect in areas you haven't collected when somebody else has the work? So we treat our collections as one. No loan to be unreasonably withheld, no red tape. We didn't actually change trade ownership. In other cases, we'll talk about other models, but it's really exciting just to open the door to many, many ways of thinking about ownership, including long-term loans, as was discussed.
I remember you saying, and we will, we're sort of planting the seeds for the next
I think
phase
that's
of the
just the
conversation,
intro.
and we're
So
watching.
it's a drum
them.
roll for the...
But one of the things you learned, so you and the Getty co-acquired the Robert Mapplethorpe archive, and I love what you said is it doubled the number of curators who are working.
Yeah, so with collectors, and there's a recent collection that was just gifted to LACMA, Brooklyn Museum. Where's...
Hands over there, raise your hand to Brooklyn and
There
and
you
the
are.
MoMA.
And MoMA. And the idea was, it's like triple the curators of people who are interested in the work. And with different changes in leadership and curatorial, people might or might not be interested in a particular segment based on their expertise. If you triple the number of people, you increase as a donor the number of people who might be interested in really dealing with that subject matter. So I think you get more for your money as a donor if you share. And so we're sharing this collection in another complicated way. Right. That's cool.
I love that idea. And finally, you used this phrase when you spoke to us in Austin about the pride in sharing and how museums have had such pride in owning. And you see that in the press releases, the annual reports, and there's nothing wrong with that. But how you're on the board of Art Bridges Foundation. We're going to hear from their CEO, Ann Kraybill, later on, whose mission is to get museums to share more art. How do we reinforce more pride in sharing?
So at LACMA, in one of my first years, I was at an exhibition, and one of the curators said, well, my colleague in the other department wouldn't lend me that object, so I got a similar one from the museum in Istanbul. This happens at the Metropolitan and museums all around the world. Each department has this sense of ownership, and if you like the person or don't like the person, or that's the thing, and it just kind of strikes you as insane that things wouldn't just be easily available. And I think there is, seriously, of course there's pride in ownership and care, because you care for a child or something, you take that pride and care, but that can be smothering care. And so I just think we need to flip it around a little bit and say, the more we share, that could be the highest goal for a museum not to hold on to. And many museums do that. I'm being playful with some of the kind of patterns.
Thank you. That was a great segue into our next conversation. Michael's going to stay in place. Calling up the partners of the Mohn Art Collective, also known as MAC3. The Mohn Art Collective is a project in which Jarl Mohn and his wife Pamela gave a collection of almost 300 works of emerging LA artists to be co-owned by 3 institutions, by MOCA, by the Hammer, and by LACMA, with an endowment to keep them in one place with their own curator on site, but also with an endowment so the 3 museums would be collectively adding to that singular collection. And that's one of the things that makes it so extraordinarily different. So Jarl Mohn, and we've got Jarl Mohn, collector and benefactor of just about every Los Angeles arts organization you can imagine. To his left, Zoe Ryan, the director of the Hammer Museum. Ann Goldstein, who's the interim director of MOCA LA, where she spent a great part of her career as a senior curator. So back to LA for Ann from Chicago, and then Michael Govan again. So Jarl, just talk about how the project evolved.
Here we go. You'd think as a disc jockey, the first thing I would do would be to turn the microphone on. Goes to show you how long it's been. the creation of MAC3 and the way it came together, it's really been a bit of a surprise about how almost effortless it has been. And I think it's really a testament to the kind of city that Los Angeles is and the heritage of the city of Los Angeles with an incredible community of artists. And the artist community has been really vibrant there. I mean, we can use a music analogy that some people may be more aware of, which would be Laurel Canyon in the 60s and the 70s. People would say there was something in the water at the time because the camaraderie, the music that was created, and the affinities amongst these artists. Sadly, I think on the music side, at least my perception is that is kind of faded. But I think on the art side, it has never been stronger than it is today. So when we started talking amongst ourselves about this idea about what to do with this collection, there was universal excitement and energy, and it really came together naturally. And I think one of the other elements, and I'd like to credit the Getty for this, which is, it's when I first started thinking about this, Pacific Standard Time. I kept hearing from my friends who were working at museums, curators, directors, so forth, how much they loved working with each other. And so that, along with this vibe that was in the community of artists, I think made it just happen naturally.
Can maybe each of you can talk a little bit about how did this collection, because it did make a certain sense for various strengths and gaps in each institution, right? Whether the museum already had some of these artists or didn't have any of them. Can you talk a little about how it fits? I mean, for the directors. Sorry.
You actually are in Los Angeles
Sure,
the
I'll go
longest. Yeah, since I'm a newcomer.
Exactly, the newcomer,
Compared to Anne.
4th week into the job. And thrilled to be here and to be part of this incredible initiative. Having been at MOCA in its early years, from like 1983 to 2009, and then coming back 16 years later, there's so many moments of incredible eye-opening. And in the early days, I think there was the competition between all of the institutions, the ideas that everybody should have the same artists for themselves. And in many ways, that's always going to continue. But I think that coming back into Los Angeles at a moment where there is such a profound support for contemporary art and investment on the part of so many institutions in the city, and the fact that Los Angeles is such an incredible artist center in this country and in the world, it makes so much sense to come in and to come into this initiative. And after all the institutional experience I've had, where I've seen duplications of works, not just collecting the same artists, but actually sometimes the same photographs that might be by the same artist in different institutions. When I was in Amsterdam, I was at the Stedelijk Museum, and the Rijksmuseum is like 1,000 feet away, and they have the same collection. And that seems so ridiculous to repeat and overlap in those ways. So this idea of creating a resource, creating a kind of friendly collaboration, thanks to the incredible resources and generosity of Jarl and vision. I think it's an incredible opportunity for us and to support Los Angeles, which is such an incredible city.
Maybe I'll go next as definitely the newbie in the room, having only been at the Hammer since January. I think for us, what is incredible is obviously the MAC3 and the collection, that is the founding collection of MAC3, grew out of Made in LA, which is the Hammer's biannual. And for the Hammer, the idea of MAC3 really expands all the possibilities of what we can do with Made in LA. And at the core of that, obviously, is that Jarl and Pamela, who support arts in LA in all kinds of ways, but were very visionary in that they started collecting from Made in LA in 2012 when we started. So have one of the best collections already amassed. And then with the group of works that the Hammer is providing, we will have, I think, 385 or something like this works that will be the founding group of works in MAC 3. For us, I think it goes to Michael's point about there is definitely a lot of brain around the room. Because all the curators from the three institutions, we have 3 curators from the institutions that get together with us and really think about what we're collecting, and it really opens up, I think, really different lines of communication. And for me, what was, I think, really terrific in a sad way about MAC 3 was when I joined on January the 5th. On January the 6th were the fires. And in a matter of days, Michael and then Johanna, who was at MOCA, we were on the phone together. I think a testament to MAC 3 and the founding, because those lines of communication were already open. We already had kind of a collaboration and partnership, and we were beginning to discuss, what could we do to contribute to the obviously fire relief, especially for the artistic community. Again, with Jarl's help, because he's simply the best. And then partnering with the Getty and others, of course, we created the Fire Relief Fund that was giving immediate support. So I felt in that way, MAC 3 served many different purposes, because it really brought me into dialogue with you and Johanna. One other funny one was when we were, during Freeze, we had an opportunity, again, because of Jarl, to go and acquire a work for MAC 3. And the 3 directors and Jarl paced around the fair early. And Michael and Johanna made a beeline to a work by Edgar Arsenault, because they knew that we had all collected work by him. They knew what was in our collections, and they knew how this piece would really contribute, because we didn't have a piece of this quality, scope, and scale. And I thought that was, just getting off the starting blocks. But then Jarl and I were sidebarring about a contemporary artist that we'd seen that we didn't know anything about, Shaniqua Jarvis. And again, back to the idea of Made in LA being somewhat the genesis of MAC 3, and the idea of us supporting, this next generation of artists. We asked Jarl if he would help us also support, and we acquired a work by Shaniqua. So I think for me, it's very manifold, the possibilities and how expansive this collaboration can be.
Zoe's giving me a little more credit for this than I really deserve. I noticed in the conversation when we were deciding what to acquire, she was being very quiet. And I said, Zoe, what's on your mind? And she says, well, Edgar, we collect him, we know him, he's a great part of the community, we all love this work, it's great, but shouldn't we make a statement about an emerging artist? So it was really Zoe who was behind the Shaniqua Jarvis acquisition. I had nothing to do with it.
All right. Michael, go ahead.
I've already talked about the benefits of sharing. You're feeling the dynamic of the benefits of sharing. And truly, museums are, they're vessels for art, but they're really vessels for people, hopes, dreams, ambitions, connectivity. And I think it just teases it out. I think LA is like a fantastic laboratory for that, because we're kind of big enough to have that diversity and small enough to know each other. But I think important point that Anne raised is it doesn't mean everybody becomes the same. Right? Like, we've all had shows with artists, and then we've collected them in depth, and we're in a reservoir at MOCA for Rothko. Barely, we have one. But so it doesn't mean it's just taking this section and segment of what we do as a way to create all the connectivity and all the benefits that accrue way beyond the sharing of art. And I think that's one of the main points, is that these instruments that we create mean so much more than the bricks and mortar. Their connections to communities and people, and we are a little bit sharing a brain that's larger if we can share the diversity of our perspectives.
I'm not the first to say this, but it's clear that the next era of museums is going to have to see a lot more collaboration kind of across the board. And one of the things I think you're saying is just pick your area, because and find the right people. But I love all the fact of how well it's gone, but talk about what's hard, because this is not native behavior. What were the challenges to overcome? And I know when I talked to Jarl first about this, he said Michael was smart enough to say they always met over cocktails.
That softens all the issues.
No, we've tried to keep it very social, and that helps a great deal. But and maybe Michael or Zoe, can address something that was difficult. I don't think we've gotten there yet. I'm sure it'll happen. I mean, it happens with any collaboration. It happens with any joint venture. It'd be unrealistic for us to assume that that's not going to be the case. But I think the camaraderie, the sense of community, and how much joy everybody seems to be having with this has helped us overcome a lot of things. And I'm not being Pollyanna-ish about this. We really haven't hit anything hard yet. I know we will.
Well, we all have CFOs, and so we have cocktails, and then they actually do the work and crunch the numbers, and then we have arcane discussions about our rate of return expectations on our endowment and how we should calculate that for Jarl. So it's not like there isn't a lot of nitty-gritty detail, which we're still working out.
But you get all that done before you bring it to me, which is so sweet.
Right, we're so sweet.
So one of the great things about this partnership, you're feeling the camaraderie, but just to state the obvious, 2 of the 3 museums are being led by different people than actually were in place as leaders when this was established. There's something also about this that collaboration isn't, big projects need to transcend and succeed the leaders, right?
Well, actually, that is the point. Okay, the institutions are good and bad. Everything's good and bad. It's in the strengths or the weaknesses. Like a lot of the weaknesses of institutions is that they can be slow and difficult and all of that. But the beautiful thing is that they, again, are vessels that go beyond our lives or tenures if they're constructed well. And this was immediately, we barely even have a little like the hint of the halo of the institution. Of course, Jarl's here, but it already works because when you establish shared principles, you buy into it. That's, I think, why we have institutions to transcend lifetimes or tenures. And so it's working even in a micro way here.
And Jarl has also had a long relationship with all of these institutions. So it didn't just start with one. It's really...
including Anne in her first iteration. When I was building my first collection, which was minimalism and light and space, Anne put together one of the most, some of you probably have seen it, the primary structures minimal show at MOCA. I don't know, what year was that?
2004.
2004. And I was really starting to get very excited. I think, it was maybe 2000 I started to really become investigating minimalism. Anne gave me one of the first copies of the catalog, walked me through the show, kind of held my hand and helped direct me in the beginnings of that collection, which is, so we have a long history ourselves.
That's great.
Also, we approach this with the generosity of spirit, but I think we also, Anne will know this, I think for me what's really important about the project is it's very civic. And Jarl has sort of set the gold standard. Anne and I used to work in Chicago, and I always really appreciated how civic philanthropists were there. When they give to the Art Institute of Chicago or the MCA, or they really give to the city, like they're building a collection for the city. And I feel like Jarl, with this project, in many ways, I feel like it has this sort of ethos that you're setting the gold standard for what is civic philanthropy, which, I think is even more important, that we are giving back, and the platform for LA artists is absolutely at the core of this. How do we support them and provide those platforms across 3 institutions? And also, I think the other thing that is so... it's not exciting to that many donors to talk about storage or to worry about storage along with us. It's very anxiety-inducing, as we've all said in the statistics. My God, I'm going to go back and every piece scrutinize even further. But it is, it's disappointing also when there's a piece of work that you think would be so important for the museum, but you cannot, you're just struggling to either accept the gift or make the acquisition because of the storage concerns. And Jarl has really embraced the idea by, endowing storage in perpetuity for these works. And I feel, Jarl is beloved by artists and very revered by other collectors and donors, which is extremely helpful for us because he is an influencer and has already influenced, I think, a lot of other collectors who are now having those kinds of discussions with us, who would never have cracked open the door to a conversation about, if I, give you this, what else can I do in terms of storage for that piece? And I think that is invaluable.
Thank you.
Well, as Michael, you talked about curators can sometimes, or any museum professional can think about a collection being theirs. Sometimes museums think about donors being theirs. And I think this is such a great example of a donor who, you bet on the right donor, obviously, who thought of each of you as his, right? And we're willing to share together. But let me ask you now to talk about what's happened, because one of the most exciting things is about the capacity of just the fact of creating this collaboration has opened you up to a couple things. Zoe talked about you had a platform to think about the fire relief development, right? So all of a sudden it didn't come out, have to go, how do we start a new conversation? There was one happening. But the one I'm most excited about, which is one I think was completely unexpected, talking to Jarl, is MAC3 is now receiving gifts from others. Can you talk about this? Because I think this is so exciting about how this kind of generative collaboration is attractive to other people.
Well, I'd like to do the setup to this because Michael probably won't take credit for this as he should. But we were walking through the conversation that Zoe brought up about us all going through freeze last year, and trying to decide what we wanted to acquire from MAC3. We were going through a booth, and again, the fair hadn't opened yet. We're stepping over things. They're installing at booths, and we're worried we're going to bump into things. And we went through one gallery, and there was a Noah Purifoy exhibit, and we were looking at it. It was beautiful work. And Chelsea Hadley here. Chelsea, could you raise your hand? Chelsea is the director of MAC3 and a longtime friend of mine and former employee of Michael Govans at LACMA, and has done a number of projects with the artist Ed Richet. And Michael, knowing that Ed Richet has been on the Noah Purifoy board, a foundation for many years, I thought, jokingly, said to Chelsea, you ought to call Ed up and see if he'll buy one of these for MAC3. And we all kind of giggled. We thought that was pretty funny. I didn't take it seriously. 4 days later, Chelsea calls me and says, I talked to Ed, and he said he'd think about it, and he thought about it. He said, no, I'm not going to buy one of those Purifoys, but I have some things in my collection, and I'd like to give MAC3 a collage. And so we ended up with this magnificent collage from Noah Purifoy from Ed Richet's collection, and that was really exciting. And then we have announced that. We haven't announced, you have to be careful of this yet because we haven't gone public. But you would never betray me, would you?
There are reporters in the room. Remember.
The reporters would never.
There may be something, the point is that you would not be surprised to learn that kind of gift might attract others, right? And there might be other announcements in your future.
There will be other announcements
Yes, right.
very soon, thanks to Michael and Chelsea and, Ed Richet. And so
it was a beautiful thing that an artist gave the first work to the collection of artists, because it's a thing in LA that artists collect each other's work. And there's a thing about artists, too, because we've all worked with Ed Richet. He loves us all, I think. And he wouldn't want to give it to LACMA or MOCA or Hammer individually, would he? But there's that thing. I just give it to all of them, and then I'm like, I love them all. And so there's a nice quality to the spirit of that, again, artist to artist. And then the other part of the spirit is in future announcements that we're thinking about that. We've inspired others to imagine that when they gift works, they will also add money to the pot for storage so that your statistics grow appropriately with the backup to them. And so that's one of the most innovative and exciting ways that we're thinking about this. And it's hard for a collector to say, I'm giving you the work, isn't that enough? But the stewardship is the other half of the work. And so then it's a total gift, if it really comes with that, as yours are.
Any other thoughts about, how the surprise of that, Zoe? I mean, I'm thinking about it in terms that, private museums built on private collections do eventually receive gifts. So obviously people have made great gifts to the Frick collection, but it was many, many decades before an unrelated party decided to make a gift to that collection, right? This took 4 months, 3 months, right?
Well, Jarl said that he's very good at branding in business. And we talked about, that's why it's also Mac 3 too. You can spell it out, or it's a thing. You could put it on a baseball hat or on your socks.
Swag.
Swag. So we plan a lot of swag.
Merch, man. We start with merch and we work backwards. We reverse engineer everything from merch.
This is, of course, the man behind MTV. Sound familiar? 3 letters. Well, where do you all see this going? I mean, you've shown this capacity to incorporate new leaders, a capacity to incorporate unexpected activity quickly, to respond to unimaginable crises in your hometown. What else do you see coming down the road for Mac 3 and what it means, especially for this community? I love what you've said about how this starts transforming a relationship between 3 institutions that all will thrive and find their own role in serving the arts in LA and beyond.
I think one of the interesting things also is how we collect, right? So the Made in LA years, we're collecting from Made in LA. And then the off years where the curators select work from the LA community, other work that will build depth and breadth, or brand new work that we're looking at. So the other thing is I feel very fortunate because we have people on the ground, like also just really keeping us up to date with the scene in LA and the artists that are working and people we need to watch out for. It's interesting when you think the Made in LA, which will open on October the 4th, I have to do a bit of plug here. There are many artists in that show that have lent work by other artists in the show, and we're going to sort of trace some of that in the exhibition. So it is true, there is big support by artists for artists in LA. But I think the other thing, I think a testament to why people are interested in this and why they want to give is also there is a real trust in our institutions that we will do right by the work, but also that we are genuine about that, that we do want to support our own in a way, and it's not easy to be in LA as an artist, and getting incredibly, more difficult just because costs and other environmental things that keep cropping up. So I think, the more that we can do to create that community around Mac 3 and the work, and obviously get the work to be seen, and support one another in those efforts, it's really important. But this is a good, I think, starting point and springboard for us to imagine what might come next.
Yeah, exactly. And I think even the word, when we're discussing branding, the word collective came up partly intentionally, that we don't know what the future is, but we know it's going to generate something. Because just the work together, the collection of minds and energy and creativity and curators. So intentionally, it's supposed to do things we've never imagined, as Zoe's saying, right? That's part of the point of it.
And I think the artist community, back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is such an important part of Los Angeles, and I think it's the real basis for what the city is all about. I think a lot of ideas are they're not going to just come from us or just from the curators. They're going to come from artists, and we have some great stories about how, all these institutions somehow kind of interlock. One of the small institutions that we support is called LAND, LA Nomadic Division, which funds public art, and we do a series of grants every year called the Mohn Land Grants. And we give an artist $5,000 to create public art. And in our very first year there, which was, I think, the first time we did that was 2023, there was a young an artist from Guatemala who lives in LA now named Jackie Amezquita. And Jackie did a public display protesting, did some signage about people who have died in ICE detention centers in Los Angeles just prior to 2023. The curators from the Hammer discovered her, put her in Made in LA 2023. She did a magnificent piece. Is it 144 tiles? I don't know how many. It's a grid, 144, and made with each from a different neighborhood in Los Angeles. Earth mixed with cornmeal and rain, and then bordered in copper. It's beautiful. It's a magnificent piece. Ended up winning our Mohn Award that year, you know, in Made in LA, and now it's on its way to LACMA.
It was hung yesterday, so you can go see it along with 6 other works from the Mac 3 collection that are on view at LACMA right now in our current collection show. So
it's
can
just
actually see it.
It's just to the question we always think about what's it going to be. I just think it's going to be highly iterative, and we have so many creative minds, including the minds, particularly the minds of the artists. They're going to take us to different places, and I think we're all ready and flexible and raring to go.
All those words, when I was given the remit to start Remuseum, the language that David Booth and Alice Walton used was to help museums rethink their legacy systems and innovate. And one of the things I felt was that, you know who wouldn't have a hard time doing that is artists. And sometimes museums just need to embody the spirit of artists as much as they can. And I love everything you've said here. It's about something about this collaboration has freed you in a way that artists are, to be generous and generative, to be iterative, to reimagine what you're going to be tomorrow can be different from what you were yesterday. And what a great symbol of the capacity for museums to adapt and give back to their communities and to each other. So I'm one of the ones who are very excited to see where this thing goes and how you'll inspire others around the country. Thank you all. Thank you. As we transition, go ahead and sit down. I'm just going to call out, our report lists 2 other examples of museums sharing collections, and we just didn't have time enough to include them today, and 2 of the partners are in the room, and one is the really beautiful partnership between the Fisk University Galleries in Nashville, whose director Jamal Sheets is with us, and Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, whose director Rod Bigelow is here. You see their partnership. About 12 years ago, Crystal Bridges made an investment in this Alfred Stieglitz collection, which was given to Fisk by Georgia O'Keeffe. Extraordinary collection of modernist works, allowed Fisk to better preserve them, care for them, modernize its own galleries, and exchange the work every 2 years. And as though that weren't enough, I thought, well, that's great. The work gets seen in both places, which is a lot more people than can see it in either one place or the other. But it was really when I was talking to Jamal, I understood how sharing art changes relationships. And it was just at a certain moment he talked about how, you know, there were some bruises at first, if you know the whole story of what Fisk had to go through to get there. Not caused by the current partners, but just the process of getting there. And he said, he just dropped it. He said, you know, I talk to Jen Padgett every week. I was like, well, the work just changes place every 2 years. Why do you talk to her every week? He said, because this is a real partnership and we're writing a catalog together, documenting the collection. And all of a sudden that light bulb went off, that this is what, when you share ownership, you share a lot more than exchanging a work back and forth between 2 facilities. And that's what we're feeling called to. So that story is in there. And also another LACMA alum, Zoe Carr at the Memphis Brooks Museum, has a really wonderful partnership with the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel. They co-acquired the archive of the Hooks Brothers photo gallery, which was the dominant documenter of Black middle-class life in Memphis for a very long time, as well as documenting the civil rights leaders, the great blues musicians that all were in or traveled through Memphis. And their photography, of course, is very suitable for this kind of partnership. Memphis Brooks is cataloging them, and they've already got tours organized in Japan where they can have exhibition prints made. And it's just leading to another kind of beautiful partnership. And we celebrate that as well because Zoe joined us in Austin in January. So I just want to mention those will be in the report when you see them, and thank them also for modeling new ways of sharing. But now we're switching to a different kind of story. So I mentioned Art Bridges Foundation. I think the largest foundation exclusively focused on American art museums and in promoting more art sharing, community engagement. Its CEO is Anne Kraybill, who is the founding director of education and community engagement at Crystal Bridges, so knows that ecosystem, also went off and has run museums herself. and she's going to be talking to some of her partners, to Adam Levine, the director of the Toledo Art Museum, and Sam Gill, the CEO of the Doris Duke Foundation, about new ways of thinking about sharing art. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll just give you the kind of 20,000-foot overview of Art Bridges in case folks don't know about it. But it was founded by Alice Walton. She created Crystal Bridges, Museum of American Art in her hometown because she believed everybody deserved access. But she did so with, how much storage do you have, Rod? Minimal storage. She does not believe that art can exist without a viewer. So she really has this very, directive to the curatorial team that these artworks need to get out, and it doesn't necessarily need to be at Crystal Bridges, but they need to be out in the world. And if they haven't been out in a certain amount of time, should we even have it? So they're a nervous curatorial team over there with that directive, but it has a really robust program as a result. So this idea of can we get art out of storage then kind of blew up into a national model of can we work with partners who have really great collections and redistribute them across the country to institutions that maybe have great core collections, but they just don't have acquisition funds. I was the director of the Westmoreland Museum of American Art, and I had about $80,000 a year. And again, a really great core collection, but it was shaped by the collecting tastes of the folks at the time. But we also find really great collections in small institutions too. The Ulrich, Vivian's here from in Wichita, Kansas. Small gallery space, but really great works of art. So we essentially give logistical and financial support to get the works out of storage. But one of our bigger barriers is not having anything to do with money or our team of registrars or being able to get art shippers and pay for the insurance and the crating. Our big issue is registrars and conservators. And so we run into issues with them all the time. Michael says he's got a really great relationship with his conservation team. And one of the issues we had, and this was talked about at the convening, was the Toledo Museum of Art, their wonderful conservator, denied loans to an institution that we had lent 74 times to before. Like we had a really robust history of lending. Some of the same artists. Some of the artists who created these works before electricity, before HVAC systems. And so I really pushed back on Adam. And so I want to ask you first, like, how do you navigate the tension between your role as a public institution and art sharing and your conservation team?
Yeah, so there's a lot in there. Thank you, Anne. Hi, everybody. So I think to make the answer as short as possible, I think the first thing to say is there's the conversation about science, right? There's the conversation about standards, and then there's the conversation about culture. And culture both within a part of the museum and within the museum as a whole. And sometimes what we're navigating with any one of our colleagues is also the tit for tat, right? The political capital bank, right? What we say yes to versus what we say no to, knowing what's on the horizon. So in this instance, we have an extraordinary collection, a superlative collection, but by design, not a very deep collection. And we have an opportunity to travel works that normally wouldn't travel because we are reinstalling the collection for the first time in 40 years, in part because we need to replace the heating and cooling system. Because yes, these works existed, but now they're used to this nice stable climate. But what was very clear was while I was optimizing on legitimate conservation point of view, I was doing so using a logic that and I don't think many of us would use in almost any other setting, which is we were treating risk as binary. It either existed or it didn't exist. And if it existed, then we would not measure how incremental it was. That was necessary and that was sufficient to not lend, right? That's a very strange way to behave. And implicit in sort of what Michael was talking about lending to a fair, we weren't measuring return. We weren't measuring reward, right? To what end? And reward must align with our mission, which conveniently is broad and innocuous to integrate art into the lives of people. So what we did is we began having an internal conversation about how we might actually objectively, but not necessarily in a way which is beyond reproach or critique, but how we might objectively begin a conversation about how we could quantify risk quantify return, quantify marginal risk and marginal return, and then make a decision that is informed in reason and logic rather than in simply looking for expedient ways to say no.
So you did quantify this, and I don't know if the slide. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Why don't you just so
Here's
look.
some math.
Yeah, so look, and this is not the prolegomena to all risk conversations about conservation, but like this is, and it's also not rocket science, but I think one of the things that we all know for those of us who engage with David is like simple ideas well executed, right? It doesn't have to be rocket science, it's usually just staring you right in the face. So this is like a pretty standard way to think about risk, right? The chance of something happening versus the probability of something happening, or the magnitude of something happening, so value, right? So if you move to the next slide, we have to nuance this a little bit in the case of artwork. So it's the chance of something happening, the value lost from damage, and then we would conserve it. So it's the value recaptured, and there's a cost to conservation. So you add back in the cost of conservation and to the total cost. And if you move to the next slide, I think we've got one more. And you can quantify it. It's like math, right? What's useful about this is someone will say, oh my gosh, you're dollar denominating this, how crass. Look, it's just a unit of measure. You can choose other units of measure. You can figure out the way you want to do it at your institution. But what it allows us to do is it allows us to then say, okay, here's the quantifiable downside risk that then we can compare to our risk. What is the risk within our building? We can compare to the reward, which in our case was how many people are going to see it per dollar, right? So, and that allowed us to come pretty quickly to the realization that when you're lending, you're free riding on someone else's investment in their HVAC, and it's actually very hard to make the math not work to lend to other places. So yeah, this is obviously, we're leaving all the objects anonymous, although you can see they're like fairly substantially valued objects.
Well, and we found even sometimes that lending institutions hold borrowing institutions to a higher standard than even they can make, right? And even our own loan agreements, we realized we need to update them and include BSO standards and really just push back on the one-size-fits-all approach to lending, that not all artworks, some are, as Michael has said before, they're much more durable than we give them credit for.
And then whether you subscribe to this method or not, it's a pathway into a conversation. Right? It denominates a conversation, which then I think, to the point of how partnership opens up other pathways, it opens up dialogue around conservation and registration in ways that have been really helpful in other arenas.
Yeah.
I think it also, whether you use the math or not, what the math illuminates is a fallacy of a lot of these discussions, I think, which is that, especially, I think this can happen on the curatorial side, out of reverence for the objects, which is that the implied cost of any quantum of damage is infinite to the object. The implied cost of one year of perpetuity that is lost is somehow infinite, and that's just not the case. There are actual costs to real audiences right now as a result of holding of really counting the marginal cost of damage as being infinite. It's not infinite. It actually can be quantified.
So Sam, talk a bit about your thinking after this convening in Shangri-La and the 4,500 objects that you steward at the Doris Duke Foundation.
Yeah, so just so people have context, Doris Duke Foundation is a private foundation that operates a range of national programs, but we also own and operate 2 centers that were estates of Doris Dukes. And one center is a spectacular compound in urban Honolulu called Shangri-La. And the sort of defining feature of Shangri-La is this really remarkable collection of more than 4,000 objects from global Muslim cultures, many of which are sort of built into the structure. And we were we're in the middle of a period in which what the structure had really been over the last kind of 20 years was just a museum, and which isn't to say that wasn't a really important way to elevate these objects and to connect them to audiences, but like I don't think I need to explain to anyone the structural challenges of running a museum on an island, 2,000 miles from the nearest continental landmass, not to mention it's in a residential neighborhood, and so there were huge use limitations. So it's like you're topping out at about 18,000 people a year that can see this thing. And thanks to the encouragement of, Vishaka Desai, who ran Asia Societies here, she's one of our trustees, the encouragement of our trustees, we really thought about look, is this place really more than a museum? And can this collection be part of a center that is helping to connect and convene and inspire a wider array of people? And the challenge that we confronted is that as we've been going through this transformation, we had really been seeing our collection as a burden, as a problem, right? So first there was this programmatic problem, which is that damage is also real. So as I point out, the marginal cost is not infinite, but the salt air of a tropical island is not great for textiles. And we had all of these incredible textile objects. So we had this programmatic challenge of like, gosh, what do we do with these things? We saw them as a liability. We had an operational challenge, which is that even under the best conditions, it is actually very difficult to store and conserve objects in Hawaii. It can be done, but climate control is more expensive and less accessible by and large. And it's really expensive. This is some of the most expensive real estate in the United States, and we're using it to store objects that no one can look at. And so, you guys have begun a process. We're still at the idea stage, but what this conversation really helped us to see was that this wasn't a problem, it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity for these incredible objects that Doris Duke in her lifetime noticed, collected, conserved, celebrated, to potentially reach much wider audiences by not thinking of ourselves as exclusively operating within these four walls. And that actually the collection could be our portal to and our connection to other institutions, other people, other places, other works of art that these works could be in dialogue with. And so what we're thinking about now is, and beginning to work on is, first, can we be extremely clear, ruthlessly clear about what we could ever present in Hawaii because of the climate risk, and we would ever because of the programmatic opportunity, the way in which they could serve this much wider program that we're convening. And anything that's of value that doesn't meet both of those criteria, how can we identify a way to really turn it into the highest circulating art lending library imaginable? And we don't quite know what that means. It could mean permanent storage on the mainland, but we think what it definitely means is a conservation team and a curatorial team whose raison d'etre is, where is the place this thing can go to create the highest possible value, not what exhibition allows me to justify continuing to store this for 95%, 99% of the time that we have it. So that's sort of the journey that we're embarking on.
That's fantastic. And I can't wait to see what partners you find. And where
Me too.
Yeah, we could maybe help. We don't have time to unpack this, but I don't want it to go unnoted that there's major climate implications for all of this too, right? We run these HVAC systems and we try to keep these standards that we just can't possibly meet, and we're adding to the carbon footprint. So while we were not founded as, a climate organization, we are finding that access and climate are parallel tracks, and, we're doing everything that we can to reduce our carbon footprint when it comes to shipping, when it comes to crating, when it comes to our HVAC standards as well. So any final thoughts? I think we're like a super lightning round of 15 minutes, so.
Actually, maybe just to ask Sam to also share with the group some of the digital initiatives you found for sharing your collection, because I think specifically vis-a-vis video games, because I'm not sure everyone here knows that, and I also think it's an interesting example of how collections can be activated even when they're not on view, but in deeply meaningful ways.
Yeah, I do think that, encountering an object on a wall with a didactic is a really powerful way to understand and encounter art. It's been a really important way to encounter art in my experience, and my guess is everyone here, is here because you've had that experience and you curate and shepherd that experience for other people. But it's obviously not the only way, that you can encounter art. And I think, all kinds of curatorial forms of media, whether it's news media, whether it's entertainment media, or whether it's sort of this more rarefied media of fine art, I think a lot of institutions are caught between meeting audiences where they are and judging audiences for having new tastes and new approaches. And the latter approach is just not practically that successful, in addition to being a little bit, I think moralistic. And so, because we face some of these intrinsic structural challenges in getting audiences into the compound, we've really increasingly tried to say, look, anywhere that you can encounter the art that Doris Duke collected and be inspired by it, that's what Shangri-La is. So we placed some of our objects in Assassin's Creed Mirage, which is part of one of the best-selling tentpole franchise games, where their historical setting reflected some of the strengths of our collection. And our view wasn't, this is an advertisement to come to our museum. It's like, this is Shangri-La for you. And why should we be judging someone who wants to find entertainment, edification, and enlightenment all in one place? We should be enabling that and encouraging that. Another thing that we're doing are we're beginning to partner with podcasts that have large followings for some of their YouTube and video content, because that's how podcasts are now getting incremental audience. And I think if you're listening to the American Idol contestant Nyam Tangi, who's from Hawaii, being interviewed and performing, and there's amazing objects behind you, that you shouldn't feel that that's a diminished experience of our collection. You should feel like, wow, what I'm watching is made more powerful by this incredible art that's around it. That's a form of curation. And so we've been seeking to kind of to venerate, to celebrate, to enable that kind of curatorial experience.
So more art to more people in more places. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Anne.
Talked about the growing pressure on museums from the growth of collections, from the growing cost of maintaining those collections, and the necessary result of the growth in collections, meaning that museums are showing a smaller percentage of the works they own with the public. What we haven't yet talked about is the extraordinary growth in the value of those collections. And what I'm going to attempt in a very brief period here is a very moderate conversation, I hope, about the red hot third rail topic in museum land, which is deaccessioning. So the first point I would make, and some big kind of macro points, is that museums may seem never changing, but in fact they are ever changing. And the rules regarding deaccessioning and the proceeds from it are actually a very relatively recent vintage, as they are managed and overseen by the governing organizations, so the AAM and the FASB, which oversees GAAP auditing of audited financial statements, and the AMD. They're only not even 40 years old in origin. Not that museums didn't have these policies before, but they were never enforced in that way or overseen in that way until beginning in the late 80s. Second is, of course, that period has overseen not just the growth in the collections, but the even more dramatic growth in the value of the collections, thanks to the value of the art market. So it is no surprise that people are seeking responsible ways to relieve the pressure that caused by, in some respects, by the growing collections, and looking in some ways to the growing value of the collections as a possible source, a part of the way to relieve that pressure. So I'm going to talk about, of course, the one way, that the major form of relief that has been offered, we have to acknowledge, has been offered by the AMD itself. And in 2022, a very dramatic modification of the policy, the AMD's policy on deaccessioning was made to bring it into conformity with the AAM's policy from the early 90s and the FASB change they had made more recently, which allows the proceeds from deaccessioning to be used not just to acquire more art. And maybe we should take a second and say, one of the problems is, as the art grows in value, if the only thing you can do with the proceeds is buy more art, while you can sometimes buy less art than you had before, you're not really relieving the pressure or solving or finding a solve for the problem. But the AMD then allows the proceeds also to be used for the direct care of collections. And the definition of direct care was written broadly enough to be a kind of a guidepost, just a general guideline for museums to use those. The AMD intended, as I understand it, to give a fair amount of flexibility to museums to figure out how to use it. As a result, we now see some museums using it to a very broad degree. One respected museum is acknowledging in its public filings that 10 to 15% of its operating budgets are allocated to proceeds from deaccessioning. Others inform me that they're taking much more conservative views and don't really feel they have much leeway to use it at all. That may be the intended result of the AMD. I think one of the challenges the AMD has been quite strict in their way of enforcing and overseeing their previous policies. So these are actually intended to be quite different. And I think we are going to see museums continue to use them quite differently over time. It should also be noted, just to be clear, because sometimes people forget, that the policies that do oversee and manage these issues are completely voluntary in nature. The first is a safe harbor from the Financial Accounting Standards Board, which would allow museums that allows museums to not place the value of their collections on their balance sheet if they adhere to the rules around deaccessioning. Of course, museums can put the value of their collections on the balance sheet, and compared to 30 years ago, valuing even quite complicated and esoteric bundles of assets is much easier to do and update than it was in the past. Of course, just to state the obvious, the AAM is a membership organization, as is the AMD. So just to be clear, people do sort of choose their way into the system. That said, I just want to highlight, and we highlighted in the report, a few proposals that have been made I think are simply, we have to acknowledge, are reasonable ways to think about these challenges. The first is a proposal by the global museum consultant Adrian Ellis, the founder of AEA Consulting, which he calls, not surprisingly, the Adrian Ellis rule, which is that museums that sell artwork to another institution, like a museum, that adheres to standards of care at a similar or higher level than the selling institution should not need to treat that sale as a deaccessioning. Now, I think there's a lot of sense to that. So if you think of a museum that just happens to have $100,000 sitting around, not restricted in any way, and it buys a painting from another museum from $100,000, today, that $100,000 in the hands of the selling museum is restricted as proceeds from deaccessioning, just as the artwork by the buying museum is in its own way. And so in some way that compounds the issue, and I think it makes a reasonable economic argument that there could be an exception to the rule in that case. The second was articulated really well in a book called Why the Museum Matters by the then outgoing CEO of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Dan Weiss. And he makes the simple point, he's a big believer, he's watched it work in the power of shared governance. We trust governance and with a backstop of state and federal law to manage our nonprofit institutions. And he points out that the policies on deaccessioning and the use of proceeds is the only one that's actually plucked out of these institutions and overseen by others. And he just argues that the institutions themselves can be trusted to manage this as they did before. Restricted gifts to endowment are overseen by boards with the backstop of states' attorneys general. And there's not a broader national trade association policy enforcing that. So governance argument. Another is that museums should be able to exchange one long-term asset for another long-term asset in serving its mission. This has been advocated by people as different as museum influencer Nina Simon and Glenn Lowry, who points out that if you exchange the proceeds for endowment assets, why should a museum, especially museums that have dramatically changed their missions from being very object-centered to being public-centered, why can't you choose to take one long-term asset like a painting and sell it and put it into endowment to support community outreach programs? Glenn has advocated that that doesn't seem like an unreasonable position to take, and I don't think it does either. And then finally, the Yale Law Journal this fall is going to publish an article by NYU law professor Daniel Francis, in which he takes the position, it's an article called Post-Profit Antitrust, and he's characterizing a series of economic activities that don't necessarily generate a profit for the actors who enforce them, but still could be subject to federal antitrust laws. And he takes the position that the policies regarding the use of proceeds against deaccessioning could be subject to federal antitrust laws as well. I'm not a lawyer, but again, like the others, these are all wise people presenting reasonable arguments. And I think the broader position is that these are all symbols that the pressure is growing on museums, and the pressure imposed by the existing policies has had one relief valve to that growing pressure, but could need more. And it's not an unreasonable conversation, as it has sometimes been characterized, to talk about ways that museums might start finding relief from the great value of these collections to serve the missions that we all want to see them support in the long run. So, operationalizing the value of collections for an institutional goal is something our next two speakers know a lot about. Christie is very good at this, and Samantha Koslow is going to come up and talk to Adam Levine again from Toledo about some ways that he's bringing his, you saw his sensitivity to numbers and math and how he's thinking a little differently within the existing rules about how museums can benefit for their missions and operations from the value of collections and collecting.
I do think it's important to say I am actually an art historian. Like, I love art. My PhD is in art history, right? I just want to make sure everyone remembers that. Okay.
I can vouch for that.
Thank you, Sam.
Adam, thanks again for taking not only one but two conversations with us today. And I want to kind of step back and thank you again, Stephen, for introducing this part of the program. But I want to talk a little bit about your philosophy, because I know you also are a philosopher too. And just how you're someone who I think is quite revolutionary in how you've thought about collecting. We've talked a lot about that today, is adding cost to the bottom line of the institution, but you've actually found a way to generate revenue for the Toledo Museum of Art. So talk to us a little bit about your philosophy of the art market, how you think about the position of the museum relative to an art business like Christie's. I think there's a lot of perception that we should be thinking about art in different ways, but tell us more about how you think.
So hardly a philosopher, but I'll do my best impersonation. So I think actually, if you think back to the conservation panel, the thing which Anne talks a lot about, but is actually usually missing from the discourse, is not history, is the historiography of conservation science. Like, what's the history of conservation science? So why am I bringing that up? This notion that the museums are separate from the market is not only bunk, it's always been bunk. If you look at any of our institutional histories, right, what's different is the way that it's treated and covered, and the visibility, frankly, the transparency, our governance and our administrations give to it. The Toledo Museum of Art was founded by Edward Drummond and Florence Scott Libby, along with a few other incorporators. Edward Drummond Libby dies in 1925. Florence Scott Libby dies in 1933. The museum starts deaccessioning in 1933. Otto Whitman, the great director of the museum, swapped a Toulouse-Lautrec, our only one outright, for a Renoir landscape. It's a great landscape, right? But I do wish we had the Toulouse-Lautrec. One of the appropriate ways to dispose of artwork was destruction. Actually, it was in the original collections management policy. We are much more transparent as organizations, and we are much more sophisticated and frankly professionalized in the way that we engage the market now. We've always engaged the market. We've always been active collectors, right? There was a time when museums could afford the most expensive artwork ever sold, right? So the museums have always been market makers. We've always engaged the market, and indeed we still engage the market today, right? It is not as if shows of contemporary artists, right, also don't have works for sale in those shows. We're not monetizing that, but those works are being sold, right, especially the ones that come right out of the studio. So this idea that there is this hard and fast line is not only not true, it has never been true. If we are going to continue to collect, we're going to participate in the market. If deaccessioning is an important part of collection care, as everybody, national and international, says it is, then we're part of the market. So the question is not if we should be engaged in the market, it's how we articulate those boundary conditions, how we govern ourselves, and how we can use it to our advantage.
That's great. So let's talk about a specific example then. I think it's well known, you've been public about it, that the Toledo Museum has engaged in guaranteeing works at auction. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came to be and how the Toledo Museum of Art participates in that way?
Yeah, so I've had two conversations today where I appreciate almost everyone in here will know what an auction guarantee is, but just for those who don't, right? Speaking with two journalists, so just I think it's important to level set. So an auction guarantee is an option that we as an institution can buy on artwork. The easiest way to think about it is price insurance. So if you are a seller and you are looking to sell an artwork, the guarantee or the irrevocable bid, which is actually somewhat different, but effectively the same thing for this conversation, is a price floor that you are guaranteed as the consignor. But if the work sells above that price floor, you as the consignor do not receive dollar for dollar above that amount. You receive a percentage of the amount above. And different places structure it differently. So sometimes there's a fee that you get up front, et cetera. But generally speaking, there's a revenue share above the price floor. Okay. So the underwriter of the guarantee, the guarantor, receives a share of that overage. So what we did at the Toledo Museum of Art is using the same exact governance process, the same exact curatorial process that we would use for any acquisition. We determined that we would be open to underwriting auction guarantees for artwork that align with our collecting strategy, that hit our quality standards, that meet our provenance guidelines, all of the things, and reflects a price that we would be happy to accept on the private market, right? That we have to do the same pricing analysis, the same comp analysis that we would do for any other artwork, present it to the relevant committee, get approval for it, but effectively we would be obligating ourselves to buy a work for a price that if it were at auction, we would get approval before the auction to go up to that amount. If it were presented to us by a gallerist, we would be happy to present that price for that artwork to the committee for approval. The only difference is that now, if the price at auction exceeds the guarantee amount, we get cash back. So instead of leaving an auction with a pout on our face, we leave an auction with a pout on our face because we really wanted the artwork and we get paid for it. And the only fear in this is that this becomes a revenue strategy. This is not a revenue strategy. This is a collecting strategy that has a revenue offshoot, right? That is the governance. That is getting the governance right. If we say, oh, next year we're going to make $2 million in guarantees, then we start underwriting guarantees that are for the money, not for the collection, and that is deeply problematic. This is not budgeted, so it's always windfall if we receive income, because what we're doing is we're hoping to buy the artwork. And it should be said that we will guarantee with everyone, but our first guarantee was with Christie's.
I mean, I'm glad you said it. I wasn't going to say it, but thank you, because I think it's really important that people understand the background and the process and how much work and research and care goes into it. How do you think about this in the long term? Sort of where do you think this might lead?
Yeah, so I think the one, and to be clear, it was actually Glenn Lowry who first brought this up publicly. So they're very happy to share all of this, right? But it was not like we screamed, hey, we're guaranteeing. But I do think in the way it's been covered, it has, I think, flattened the point. So there's a way of seeing auction guarantees as a strategy. That is true, right? Or more specifically as a tactic, right? But if you zoom out, what this demonstrates is it demonstrates that museums have really valuable intellectual property. In this case, the discernment of quality and the understanding of price, right? And what they have done, what we have done, right, and others, I think, maybe had done previously and not spoken about it or are doing now, is they're using intellectual property that is already within workflows, right, to just create natural opportunities that could result in sort of operating windfall, right, or at the very least, right, and great objects. So the kernel there is not to say, oh, look, a museum is guaranteeing, who else is going to guarantee? It's going to say, what other opportunities are there for museums to actually play in the services space? Because the reality is, Target can't figure out retail. I don't know why museums think they can, right? Jan and MoMA might be the best examples, right? But really, the Toledo Museum of Art has no business investing the amount of money that we have invested historically in a cafe as a revenue-generating mechanism, right? There are much higher margins in the services economy, and we actually have really valuable expertise. So the way to think about guarantees, I think, as you look forward, is not, well, who else is going to underwrite guarantees, but what other types of expertise do museums have dormant that have been unexercised that can result in operating support for the institution?
That's great. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned, we've talked a lot about the market and the role that museums and art businesses play in the market. And I think we've all benefited. It's been a great time in the market. The market is strong, but what happens when the market's not strong? Do you see that as changing your philosophy or strategy at all?
No. To the contrary, when the market's not strong, it's the best time to buy. Without discussing or changing subject a little bit, so I was at the museum, then I left and I came back as the director, started in 2020. The museum had never raised more than, call it X dollars, right, in its operating budget. And we went to the board and with a budget that said we were going to raise 1.5 times the most we'd ever raised going into our 2021 year. And the reason they approved it was because our hypothesis was, whether you're looking at total return to shareholders, right, in the private market, or you're looking at sort of the way foundations give loans, right, the way you outperform is you invest through a down cycle. So the question wasn't whether we were going to be able to raise that money. The question was, do we have a hypothesis for where we would invest it? And we decided the place where we were going to invest it was in exhibitions, because at that moment people were concerned about liquidity. So there were a lot of exhibitions out there that were looking for financial partners. And people bought that hypothesis, and I think it helped some of the flywheel that we were able to start spinning. I bring that up because a down market just means there's more buying opportunity. So I think people know we deaccessioned 3 Impressionist paintings, all of which were duplicated. Every director who is living, I speak with all of them every month. Roger Mandel was living when I began my directorship. I spoke with him every month until he unfortunately passed away. Everyone wanted to deaccession those 3 paintings. They were talked about forever, right, at our art committee meetings, right, but they knew that there was going to be some pain because people don't necessarily understand the Toledo Museum of Art's collecting ethos, et cetera. So we put ourselves in a position where we have a lot of dry powder. So we sell when the market's high, right? We buy when the market's low. That's what it means to engage the market. We buy and actually, let me just unpack that a little bit too.
Go ahead.
So I think one of the mistakes museums make is we treat deaccessioning as a laborious process that must be completed as quickly as possible. And in point of fact, once the board or the relevant committee has approved deaccessioning, I think you switch from your duty of care to your fiduciary duty. So it is one of the things that Christie is a little bit annoyed with us right now. They're really trying to get a consignment for something that we've already decided we're deaccessioning, but actually—
Again, I wasn't going to bring it up, but—
But just because we've decided that in the normal course of, the Toledo Museum of Art's history of deaccessioning, we're deaccessioning in another area. It should come as no surprise to anyone. It will be announced in due course. But we decided we're going to deaccession in this area. That doesn't mean we have to consign it immediately. Right? Actually, the job at that point is to maximize the sale price. It's a different consideration. So not engaging the market is arguably also a way to fail in your fiduciary obligation. So we really think a lot about the market cycles, et cetera. So it's not a great time to sell except in certain areas, and it's a great time to buy in most areas.
And also to clarify, I'm never mad at Adam. But I just, to end it, because I think it's really important, and not to steal what Jarl said earlier, and I won't put you on the spot too much, but I think Stephen was eliminating for us some ideas of how we could change policies. But I think you've really found ways to work within the policies. So what's next? Can you share any other kind of big ideas that you have in Toledo, or that you've had from other conversations with your director community about how we can work within these boundaries?
Well, someone who has been in the background of some of these conversations, but who's not in the room, is a brilliant consultant named Anders Santo. And I think he was at one of the convenings, and he said, I think very oppositely, that museums actually don't have a lot of rules, but gosh, do we have norms, right? So, and I would say so I would also just question, like, to some of Stephen's comments just before, what are the real rules? And, there's actually a lot of latitude to work within the rules, like lots and lots and lots of latitude, right? But I think we do need to question norms. And what's quite ironic is we all believe in questioning norms in almost every other arena of society. I mentioned I'm an art historian. I'm a Roman historian. I assure you the Romans did not think that the Colosseum would exist in the form that it does today. So I think we all need to have a little bit of humility about what the future holds, and we also need to not sacrifice our interest in permanence, but we also have to understand that relevance is really, really important. So certainly the business model and operating model fuels a lot of that, and I think the key thing that we're thinking of is what are the ways that we can leverage our expertise in exciting ways that enhance visibility and therefore support philanthropy, but also support with new earned income streams.
Love it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Over to Stephen.
This is the part I'm most excited about. David Booth is going to join me. If you don't know him, David Booth is the co-founder of Dimensional Fund Advisors, worldwide investment business. He started not long after graduating from the University of Chicago Business School. He has been a great benefactor of the 2 educational institutions that formed him, University of Kansas and the now Booth School at the University of Chicago. And he's a great art collector. And so aside from the pleasure I've taken in getting to visit him and Heather in Austin at Paradox Cove, my favorite day of the month is the day I get my monthly call with David Booth. So for the last 2.5 years, he makes time to talk to me, and I share my thoughts with him, and I try to get as much of a reaction as I can out of him.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me. I can't believe what you've accomplished in the last few years with just making something whole cloth out of whatever, just rags or, you know. So anyway.
Well, I got that reaction. That was good. But I want to ask you, David, we've talked a lot about Remuseum here today, but I've never asked you, how did this whole thing start? Your conversations back in 21, 22?
Yeah, I was with Alice Walton and I were just chatting about a lot of things, but just the idea that, I mean, some of the topics came up today. The things like, because I've been on the board at MoMA for, I don't know, half a dozen years, and, you know, the first thing I learned was you can't put the assets on the balance sheet. I go, geez, I mean, that's generally accepted, you know, financial, and it went downhill from there. But I will comment on, because I like Adam's, of course, I like the formula on risk, you know. But one, listening today, there are two things I'd like to comment on. One is, you know, adding to your risk analysis. You know, the big risk is the risk of making poor choices. And that's, if you make poor choices, poor decisions, because your financial statement doesn't make sense, or you make poor choices because you won't deaccession, that's got to be costly. That should be intuitively obvious. So how can how can we help particularly smaller museums make better decisions? Which ties into another comment with all the sharing with MAC3 and stuff. You know, you and I approached it a different way, which is data sharing. Yeah. You know, it's really shocking how little data is shared among museums.
Can you, and you've heard it come up at convenings we've had, this fear that the data will be used to criticize them, and I understand that, but you built it's hard to imagine your world without data, right?
Well, if you don't have data, you're just arguing beliefs, which are kind of boring. You know, I mean, everybody can have their own beliefs, but if you have data, then you really can have a conversation.
And you, go ahead.
No, and it's not about, it's the benefit is perspective you get by sharing data. I mean, not only sharing the paintings, but sharing data. You get a better understanding of your position. I mean, nobody wants to be perfectly normal, but everybody wants to know how different they are, you know. So that's the benefit of having data.
And that's one of your insights that I've learned from, is that you want to know what the average is so you can figure out how you want to be different from that, not
yeah,
how
right.
you can be the same.
Yeah, just to make sure how you're different in ways that you hoped you were. You know, that's the beauty of having data. I mean, there's some of the data will be shocking. Oh God, I didn't realize that. But some of it reinforces the good decisions you made.
What about, let's talk about risk for a minute, because you've also heard there's a lot of risk aversion in this field, and it comes from a lot of different directions.
The obsession with risk is just unbelievable. I mean, it's like going back to simple decision theory. You know, if you know, a lot of decisions you have to make under uncertainty. I wish we knew things for sure. Basically, all the important things in life, you know, we don't know for sure what's going to happen. Nobody could have predicted 20 years ago that I'd be sitting here today, right? So it's not about eliminating risk, it's about managing risk. You know, hopefully you get better measurements, better understand your ability to take a risk, but ultimately it's about being flexible. If you spent less time trying to predict things and more trying to figure out what you're going to do under certain scenarios, be flexible, you know, control what you can control, but usually the interesting stuff is the stuff that's outside of your control, and that you just have to manage the best you can.
And what managing uncertainty has been your kind of specialty at DFA, right?
Well, that's what we talk about all the time anyway. That's but that's you know, life uncertainty is in some ways is underrated. I mean, it's without uncertainty, you know, life would be pretty dull. I mean, and it's the uncertainty that creates opportunity, and that's what really we're talking about. So you have to figure out, you know, well, I see Michael Govan. If you talk about taking risk, I mean, somebody coming up with an idea for this new museum out of tearing down May's department store building, things like that. I mean, that's what leadership is about.
And so managing uncertainty, so you ground it in data, you make your best bet.
It's all about getting, you need to do your long-range planning every year, really. And then what it's about is what I'm going to do for next year. What's the first step? Even though you want to plan long-term, many years into the future, the key is just how can I decide what to do next year? Putting that in context that over the long haul, this is where we think it's going to go. But we know whatever we think, that wherever it's going to go, that's not where it's going to go. So you just have to pay attention, do the best you can, and make good choices. And then at the end of it all, you want to make sure you judge yourself by the quality of the decision you made and not the outcome. You could have had the best plan in the world going into the pandemic, and the pandemic year just changed everything, right?
Right. So your point exactly is that the quality of the decision is more important about whether and then how you use it, whether it worked or not.
Yeah, right. I mean, sometimes you make good choices and they just don't work out. That's life.
How do you see a? Go.
I see other people in here have made mistakes just like me, so anyway.
How do you see a difference between for-profit governance and non-for-profit governance and tolerating risk and mistakes or risks and?
Yeah, no, it's really kind of discouraging nonprofits and I mean, you can understand that here you are on a nonprofit board. You're not making any money. You're doing this as a community service, so you're not predisposed towards taking much risk, I think. Whereas in business, it's just part of life. You got to take risk.
And how to be different. A business doesn't succeed by being the same.
Yeah, right. And so, but in some ways, all this attitude I think is really uplifting. Look, all you can do is the best you can do. I mean, that's, everybody's here. They've gotten their position they're in now because they're good. And so just, don't second guess yourself. Make the best informed choice you can. Get as much data as you can. Use Andrew's formula for measuring risk, and get on with it.
Yeah.
It's usually about execution. Ideas are cheap. It's execution is the difficult part.
And continuing to learn,
Yeah.
just move forward. So we talk about data. Let's talk about art. How did that come into your life, and what does it mean for you now?
Well, I was always somewhat interested in art. I grew up in a background where we didn't really have any art. Maybe the calendar, the annual calendar would have a picture of Norman Rockwell. But when I got out of school, I remember very vividly. I got an apartment here in New York, and I got a poster from MoMA. A Mondrian poster from an exhibit that they'd had, and that was my art in my living room, and then as I got a little more money, I could kind of do things differently, and then one thing led to another, and then one day I found myself with 55 acres.
Just like
of
that.
a lovely property, and so in addition to doing, art for inside the house, I developed this passion for outdoor sculpture, which is kind of unusual. And that was very stimulating because not many people have had much experience with doing outdoor sculpture. So in some ways, I was kind of didn't have much guidance. It was a clean slate. And the land, the property itself is so beautiful. And then I just went from there. So it became a passion.
One of the things I think we haven't even talked about is that I see in some way you've created 3 museum-like museums, let's say museum-like institutions. One is at Paradox Cove, Dimensional Fund Advisors, with more than a dozen global offices. You've built a collection that's curated by Heather Pizzanti, your partner, beautifully, who makes additions and conserves the work. And then when you made your extraordinary gift to the Booth School, you gave an endowment for the acquisition of art.
Right.
And one of the great things is that the Booth School at Chicago is now a museum. I think when I met with Canis Pendergrast, who's the one who's an economics professor who buys works of emerging artists really with a beautiful eye, with an eye towards the kind of art that will speak to students at a global business school, and 100% of the works are on exhibit at all times.
Yeah, it's amazing. They have a great committee. I'm just so pleased with all of that. If you're ever in Chicago and you're on the south side there with Leroy Brown, you can stop by I'm sure they'd love to give you a tour of the art.
So you've seen a role for art in helping you think differently, and your colleagues and others.
Yeah, and in particular business. I mean, Heather is in charge of the art for the business, but I think it tells employees that you care about them, and I think clients, when they come in, feel like you're welcoming. So I think it's really central to running a business.
And it makes you different again.
Makes me happy. I don't have to worry about being different. I mean, that's not been one of my problems.
Well, on the subject of risk, you and I've talked about it, but I want to just share in general that the work that we've done together and you've supported has led me to the idea that the ideas are there. We now need to support the leaders who are ready to take those chances.
Yeah, the discussion that Alice and I had to begin with is, can we put some money together to study whether or not we think we can make a difference? And that's really what I was getting at, and you deserve credit for that, taking that idea. And I think what my observation is that you've put it together. I think the answer is, working, as a community, sharing data unabashedly, as well as sharing art. Now we learned from Mac 3, museums can hopefully run much better. And art, and of course, Art Bridges is, the really central to all of this.
Yeah. And Sam Gill and I from the Doris Duke Foundation, who you heard from, have developed a plan because he sees such similarities in performing arts to actually take the next step and support leaders with innovative new ideas to test out, give them an award, a fellowship, a retreat at Shangri-La, a business curriculum, and then a cohort to develop, because we see the people. And that's why we do events like this, because I think the people you heard from, it's not me, it's not any ideas I've come up with, it's how they're using data and managing uncertainty to show us the future of the field.
Well, I mean, this field in the art museums as well, it is a long-term kind of the highest quality of life, I think, is helping other people. And art museums, by their very nature, the purpose is to improve people's lives. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that.
Pretty cool. I'm going to end because one of the reasons I wanted David here and promised him I would stay on schedule so that I could embarrass and thank him, because he doesn't always get that in public. But first, I want to say one thing about him. If you're interested in kind of the business philosophies he's expressed here in his background, David and his company are the only business that I know has had a documentary made about them by an Oscar-winning filmmaker. So Errol Morris has made a movie called Tune Out the Noise. You can find it on YouTube, and when you do, you will be maybe the 19th million viewer of this movie. It just came out about 6 months ago. So David knows something about relevance and attraction too, which is great. And then my thank you is that David is a great manager because he gives leeway to people. And I know when I share an idea with him, the best possible, I know I've done, at least I think I've done about as well as I can do. And I say, David, I don't know, I'm thinking about this. And he'll say, it might work.
That's my lengthy feedback.
That means I'm going to drive a truck through that idea right there. David, we've heard that risk capital is hard to find, patron is hard to find. I just want to end by saying you have provided that in abundance to me, to Crystal Bridges, to the museums of the country. Everything you saw today wouldn't have been possible if David hadn't said, I'm going to write more or less a blank check to an idea, let them find somebody to see what he can make of it.
As long as Alice does the other half.
And Alice join you. And I want to thank Rod Bigelow for being part of that equation, and obviously Alice Walton coming up together and being a museum that was willing. What museum would say, yeah, we'll take someone we've never met and start a project that's challenging museums within our own walls? I've been so lucky. But again, this is why support for informed mission-based risk-taking is so important, and you've modeled it beautifully. So thank you.
Thank you.